Welcome, everyone. My name is Esther Lee, President of Chinese American Heritage Foundation. Today, we have a moderated panel discussion featuring clips from the award-winning documentary film, Chinatown Rising, with historical film footage captured by Harry Chuck. Let me introduce our three guests. Our presenter and also a panelist is Josh Chuck, the co-director and producer of Chinatown Rising. Josh grew up in San Francisco, Chinatown, and has worked in the community for over 18 years as a youth worker, filmmaker, and fundraiser. He has produced and shot and edited short films, mostly shared the stories of individuals who symbolize the rich diversity of the city, as well as an organization advocating for the needs of the underserved. He currently directs the UPS Community Internship in San Francisco, an intensive community immersion program for UPS upper management, which focus on the Chinatown, Tenderloin, and Bayview neighborhoods. Chinatown Rising is Josh's first feature film. Our other panelist is Chris Kwok, the mediator and community organizer in New York City, adjunct faculty in Asian American Studies in CUNY Hunter. Chris is a mediator and arbitrator with GEMS, specializing in labor and employment law. Formerly, he was an Alternative Dispute Resolution, ADR, coordinator at the U.S. Equal Employment Commission in the New York District Office. He managed mediator in the New York, Newark, Buffalo, and Boston offices. He has personally mediated thousands of cases over the course of his career. He is an active in the field as a trainer, lecturer, and writer. He has participated in speaking engagement for organizations including the ABA, ACRGNY, Practicing Law Institute, New York City Bar, New York County Lawyers Association, Brooklyn Bar Association, Asian American Bar Association of New York, Metropolitan Black Bar Association, NYU Law School, Brooklyn Law School, and many others. He was the recipient of the ADR Frontline Champion Award from ACR GNY in 2020. So during the panel discussion, they would discuss the film as well as the history, importance, and future of America's Chinatown and the role of activism and storytelling as it relates to the Chinese American experience. And our moderator is Ryan Hopkins. He served as the National Executive Board Director for Chinese American Citizens Alliance, as well as the compliance officers for CACA LA Lodge. He is also a proud volunteer for Chinese American Heritage Foundation, and he is a very good friend to us. So right now, let us welcome Chuck to present some excerpt of the films.
Thank you. Happy to be here, and along with the other panelists especially. Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Chinatown Rising is a documentary film that got started 7 years ago when my dad called me and he was cleaning out his garage. And I found out that in one corner of the garage, he had a bunch of cardboard boxes that were taking up the entire corner. And inside those boxes were these old metal cans that were filled with film reels. And so when we took a look inside, it turned out that my dad, Harry, he had over 10,000 feet of film footage that he had shot personally in San Francisco's Chinatown in the 1960s and 70s. I started asking my dad questions about why he filmed things, about the period of time, what he filmed and all that. And it turned out that there was so much Chinatown history that I did not know. You know, even growing up in the neighborhood, even going to school in the city, I just had no idea about the activism that took place and made so much change in Chinatown. So we embarked on trying to make a film, and 5 years later, we finished the film, and we're happy that we're just at the moment about to release the film to the general public. So we're really excited about that. And I'm happy to show a couple excerpts of the film today, and then we can move on to conversation. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback and questions. So the first thing I wanted to share was the trailer to the film. It's a little less than 2 minutes. What were you planning to do with all that footage you shot?
Well, at one point I had a big film project in mind, and I actually started it.
Rarely do the Chinese in San Francisco organize themselves to express an opinion on public issues, but that has changed.
I knew Chinatown was different, but I don't know if anyone else really understood.
Chinatown at that time did not think they have a problem. So I was the one who said, no, we have a problem.
We must bring self-determination to our own community.
America is all about fighting the system when it's not right.
My gut says, you just can't do this. This is not right.
I don't think really that anybody give a damn. That is the real issue.
I didn't think that my films had any lasting consequence that would not change anybody's life.
All right, so that's the trailer for the film. You saw a little bit of my dad, Harry, Chuck in there. The second clip that I want to show is a couple minutes, and it gives a little introduction to some of the history of Chinatown, San Francisco Chinatown, and also what it was like to grow up there in the 50s and 60s. The first voice you'll hear is my dad's voice as he's kind of narrating the film.
As a child, I never questioned, why does Chinatown exist? No one ever told me why we lived here and not somewhere else. I had no idea that Chinese people had been lynched and driven from their homes. I didn't know that Chinese weren't permitted to own property or to live in other parts of the city, and how for over 80 years, the US government denied people of Chinese ancestry access to citizenship.
Chinatown is an institution created by racism because the white people believed that the Chinese could never be mixed. The exclusion law made it very clear that no Chinese can ever become citizen of the United States because we are perpetual foreigners.
Chinese have submitted to racist white policy for a couple of generations, at least. We learned that when we were kids. Don't cross Broadway Street. If you go downtown, behave yourself. When you're on a streetcar, keep quiet. You learn how to be submissive.
My dad said, don't cause trouble. Stay away from white and black people and any others. Just stay away, because you're gonna get beat up or something like that. So my first day crossing into North Beach, these anti-Chinese, they grabbed me to the fence and they used me for target practice for water balloons.
Growing up in the 60s, we did things to counter some of the cultural restrictions of our parents, which were immigrants, right? Which was, you're not supposed to go out and have fun. All you're supposed to do is go to school and then go to work. That's it.
All right, so that was the second clip. Now I'm gonna show the third and final clip. This one's a little longer, it's about 4 minutes. And this is a clip of something, an event that happened not in Chinatown, but in San Francisco and outside of Chinatown, involving a lot of young people from Chinatown. So it was kind of an example of like the outside world really starting to impact what happened inside the neighborhood. And this is, I really love this scene because first of all, it's such an example of the first person storytelling that we wanted to emphasize in the film, you know, people telling their own stories, people who were there and really involved. And then also this part of the film shows some examples of the solidarity between Asian Americans and other ethnic groups. So here it is.
A lot of changes in the Chinese community. We owe an incredible debt to the Black movement. They had a big influence on the young people in Chinatown. It's the same thing. They were questioning their leaders, the old Baptist ministers, so we were questioning our leaders.
The whole essence is that to be an American no longer means that you have to be white. The younger generation broke that myth, so to speak, and challenged that myth.
On strike, straight down! On strike, straight down!
Part of the strike was because we want to set up the School of Ethnic Studies. The purpose of those studies was to show how much contribution we made to this country and to make sure that we're not left out.
So I kind of rushed to the crowd. And I was maybe about 3 or 4 or 5 deep, you know, into the edge of the crowd. And then all of a sudden, there was this like, and people and horses and policemen and everyone pushing us back. And then they started whacking everyone. When I saw one of my friends getting his head bashed in, I saw another African-American guy got his head bashed in, and his blood was like gushing out everywhere. It was horrific. And I went, oh my God, this is not what I opted up for. What they did manage to do was to surround us all and for us not to be able to leave that circle. I was like, I think the word is shocked and then scared because I didn't know what was going to happen next. I still remember this cop said to me, young lady, well, what do you think your mother's going to say? And I went, essentially, that was my graduation present, and I was going to have to go to jail for 20 days.
The strike at San Francisco State College changed the lives of many Chinese students, heightening their awareness of racial discrimination in America. and deepening a sense of ethnic identity. It marked the beginning of an Asian American movement as young people returned to Chinatown with a new commitment to serving their community.
So those are the 3 clips, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, so let me welcome, this is our other panelist, Chris Kwok, and our moderator, Ryan Hopkins.
Thank you both very much. And I want to thank all our attendees for being here tonight. If you have a question, I just want to remind our attendees to please place your questions in the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring the Q&A chat box through the entire webinar, and I'll try to get your questions answered as we go on. So gentlemen, I wanted to first ask you both, why is it important to tell the stories of Chinatowns across the nation? And either of you can start.
Yeah, well, why don't I take a crack at it, Josh, if you don't mind? And I have seen the documentary in whole, and I'm so glad I did. And the story of Chinatown is critical. And the story of Chinatown, San Francisco, is critical to the story of Chinese America and the story of Asian America. And the reason it is, speaking as a New Yorker who grew up in Flushing, so that's the second largest Chinatown in New York City. That's not Manhattan Chinatown, but is Flushing, right? And so, you know, how would I come to appreciate that, or what? And sometimes even within Chinese communities, I'm an outsider because I didn't grow up in the Chinatowns, and neither am I a Toisan. So it's an interesting sort of view for me to come and be part of that family, which I do feel I am, because in many ways I feel like San Francisco is the capital of Chinese America. And the history starts there when the Chinese first started arriving in the West Coast, and the history of living and being in San Francisco at the very beginning of the city, at the beginning of the city, and then also being all over the Northwest and the Western territories. And when they were driven out, they went back to San Francisco, I think. And so that story is not well told, although I think Josh has alluded to it in the interviews, you hear it, but we haven't told that story as well. So there's many stories that need to be told. But Josh's documentary is a significant document of an important period in which Chinatown people and Chinese residents made a significant contribution to the creation of Asian America. And so there are many like deeply important intertwined stories coming out of that story of that Chinatown, which is critical within sort of America, I think. So it's a really big picture sort of try at that. So
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you. You know, I think all immigrant stories here in America are important to tell, honestly. I think the stories of Chinatowns are especially important to tell just because oftentimes they have a very complex, rich history. And oftentimes it's filled with community members overcoming some pretty huge adversity. And I think that's really can be instructive, especially for, you know, the general public often sees Chinatown in a certain way. And sometimes it's like a touristy way or, you know, just a very shallow exterior way. So it's misunderstood. Even the role of Chinatowns and why they exist is misunderstood. So so in that way, I think it's important for people to have a better understanding that, you know, these are not just, you know, Far East fairylands that are meant to be enjoyed by Westerners. You know, there's a reason why they're there, and it's actually a lot more complex than that. And I just appreciate Chinatowns in every city, New York, Seattle, LA, you know, Boston, Philly. I just appreciate them all because we have similar challenges, and we have over the past like 150 years. And I think it reminds us that, you know, we are not alone in our little neighborhood, but we're a wider community.
Great. I think you've touched on it a little bit, but Josh, I'll start with you, and Chris, please weigh in. Why is a film like yours so important? Why is it important that Chinese Americans tell these stories, that these stories are told in your own voice? If you could, kind of touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, we all know what usually happens, right? At least in the history books we grew up with. It's like an outsider will come into a community and find that something to them is fascinating, and that's what they focus on because that's their frame of reference. But when you're a part of the community, I think you can have so much better sense of what really is important, who is important, and again, the complexity of the history of a neighborhood is so usually there's so much more. It's so much more rich than what an outsider can perceive, and so I think that's one of the main reasons why it's important.
I love watching this film as a companion piece to the PBS Asian America series, because I think they fulfill similar roles, but in different ways. The PBS is a larger scope sort of sweep. It tells a bigger story from like 20,000 feet. I found Josh Chuck's film deeply felt. It was very Chinese because in many ways it was a son helping his father fulfill his legacy. So very Chinese in that motivation. And then the story that unspools is people talking to people they know and they grew up with. So even though I recognized many of the characters from Asian America, they were slightly different because they were talking to someone they grew up with or that they knew, and they were talking about slightly different stories. So I felt like I was along for the ride. And as someone who loves history and loves, in particular, Chinese American history, I was like, oh yeah, that really helps me fill in these gaps, because I studied these things in college. I came to law school at UCLA because I wanted to be closer, spend some time in the West Coast. And I always felt like, even when I visited San Francisco many times, I always felt at home in Chinatown. I love sort of walking the streets, and although I had no direct familial connections, I nonetheless felt very comfortable. And I did that before I even knew anybody, but I think that watching these stories, cemented my knowledge and my appreciation for sort of those things that had touched me. The social movements they had set in motion touched my life. It was good to see the people, behind it. So it was in many ways, I watched it and I watched it in one go, I fired it up like really late, and I watched it all the way through. So.
That's great. Yeah, I think you made a great point, Chris, that it's especially poignant for those that did not grow up in Chinatown, which I think is more and more true of most Chinese Americans. A lot of Chinese Americans have migrated to suburbs or enclaves outside of Chinatown, so their connection is really to Chinatown is limited, if there is any connection. So I think you made an excellent point. Josh, we had a question in the Q&A section. So how did the Chinatown establishment in San Francisco react to the activism of the new generation? What was the reaction to people like your father?
Yeah, well, the traditional leadership in Chinatown had been in place for so long. Over 100 years. And, when that's the case, there's going to be resistance to change. We're all human beings. And I think, when you're in a position where you feel like you are helping the community and you have the most experience doing so, I think you want to hold on to that and want to continue. So that was, it was a huge conflict, huge generational conflict in Chinatown. And there's just a lot of, so much was going on. It was kind of like the leadership had, for Chinatown's own protection, also had kind of isolated the community from outside forces, and tried to kind of take care of the community and represent the community to the government and others. And so, during the time of civil rights and, the free speech movement and the Black movement, all the movements that were happening in the 60s and 70s, that they could no longer do that. They could no longer insulate, the people of Chinatown, especially the young people, from being exposed to all that. And so those ideas, to the point of, also in China, Mao was coming up and bringing his communist ideals to the forefront, which were very much embraced by the young people in Chinatown. And that was really another point of contention. So it was not smooth. I'll say that. It was there's a lot of conflict, but for me, one of my favorite parts of the film is towards the end, because that conflict, the factions, they kind of come together. They come together for the greater good of the community, and that's something I really appreciated.
Yeah, I imagine it was quite scary because not only you're facing the government, you're facing the powers that be, but you have to deal with the ramifications at home, and then facing an angry parent or an angry grandparent that says, "What were you doing out there?" So definitely understand that, and the cultural impact there. So if you could both tell us about how you are using your voices to tell the stories of Chinatown, and maybe some recommendations for others who are interested in doing the same or following in your footsteps.
I think one of the reasons that these stories are coming out of San Francisco, Chinatown, these type of documentaries, is that for the immigrant population, the impulse and the time to make art comes a little bit later. Particularly when the first generation, second generation is really, focused on survival, particularly in times when racism, systemic level was very strong. So survival was key, raising your kids, giving them a better opportunity. So art and art making and preservation, those things get pushed aside because survival is paramount. And so that's why, once again, the stories of like the art come out later. But they come out first in Chinatown in San Francisco because it's the first. And so New York is big, but it's later and it's more disparate. And so, but it's nonetheless still important to have that art and culture bind people together. And, by some accounts, there are 9 different areas in New York City that you could say Asia Town or Chinatown. So it's huge. A lot of different populations representing the Chinese diaspora is huge, and regional cultures, immigration periods. So, and it's not just me, but, particularly in the age of COVID-19, see a lot of great organizations driven by young people that are arts driven, because that can help tell the story and unite. And so we're watching that happen in real time. And I think that, I've done, held film festival, Chinese American film festivals in Chinatown that at first seemed like, oh, that's really specific, but it's really great. It's drawn out stuff. It's encouraged, culture making, encouraged discussion, which is, I think, the real sort of beautiful part of art making. So.
Very interesting. And I was going to make a point. So we have a new era, if you will, of advocacy and activism, especially lately, and facing the unfortunate anti-Asian hate and some of the other things, and the impact. I know New York Chinatown is facing issues with the building of the jail there in Chinatown. What parallels do you draw between people like your father and the movement he cataloged, and then the current movement, and how do they differ, would you say?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of the issues that are coming up today that we're all very concerned about, they are similar to issues that previous generations have faced. It's weird because 5 years ago, if you asked me if how to engage young Asian Americans and energize them about social movements, I would have had no idea. I would have said it's tough because they're doing their thing, whatever, just caring about themselves and doing the young person thing. But what's happened lately with the violence and the and everything, it's really, I've noticed this really amazing energy coming from young Asian Americans. Now it's unfortunate that it had to come this way, right? I mean, very unfortunate, but I guess it's a silver lining that people have this energy, and it's kind of this anger and frustration, but also hope for making things better. So it's interesting. Yeah, I learned a lot of what I know about the community and Asian American issues, like in the last 6 years of making this film, just because I got to speak with these iconic people, like these activists that have often worked for a lifetime. And when we ask them, like, people will ask them, what should we do now? Like, what should young people do? Because you have the experience, and a lot of them will kind of say, hopefully you'll have the same spirit we did, the foundation of wanting to help the community. But when it comes to strategies and what to do as individuals, what worked in the past is not necessarily going to work in the future. So young people are very, very bright and very smart. And, so just the key is just like using that energy they have, that brain they have, and knowing of how the world works today, and setting their own path on how to improve things. Yeah.
Excellent. Chris, as a community organizer and as a professor, do you what differences do you perceive in the current movement as opposed to historical movements, and where do you see things going in terms of activism and advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I see this moment as momentous as the moment that Josh documented in 68, 69. So the first, movement was mostly Japanese, Filipino, and Chinese descendants, and they had gone through much of the similar. There were differences in their treatment, but overall they could come together as descendants of those that had been treated as Asians, excluded from citizenship. And they came together in a push for really social equality following the civil rights and Black Power movement model. And that kind of came, it had its victories, and then the movement, had some further organization building during the Vincent Chin era. But for the most part, it was fairly quiet and contained within sort of the margins of our society. Now in this era, and it's just as momentous, if not more, because there's large Asian American populations, but many of them are new and are not connected naturally to that history. So they do have to make their way through watching documentary films, reading texts, getting those things, educating, to become part of it, to decide where they want to be. And there's a question there about politics. Parents were Republicans, and the Asian American movement definitely was not. It was a very sort of far left progressive movement. And it needs to recognize that, not to be so doctrinaire, I think, is one of the things, but also to have a political dialogue, within the populations. Right now, it's difficult to have that. It doesn't really exist, but there's a lot of learning that needs to be done by the people that would nominally belong to the Asian American category. It's a political category upon which people have to make a decision to join, because it's just one of many identities that you can have. But it doesn't come sort of naturally. Even Josh growing up in San Francisco with that father and his lived experience. Didn't really know until he got a little bit older. His dad was digging through the stuff, right? And think about that, about someone that's that, sort of lineally direct, descended from that. And you think of all the people who moved to the last generation of Asian immigrants moved to the suburbs. They moved directly to the suburbs into like a white collar job, and they drive to the Chinatowns to eat every once in a while, to shop, if they do that. Very different experience. So we have a lot of work to do. There is a lot of great energy, but the task is great, and it's immense. The new people getting into the Asian American movement, again, they're bringing enormous energy, but they haven't thought about this before. So they're actually in the process of learning too. And then they're going to decide, where do I fit in? Where do I want to make this? So we have to have a spirit of cooperation that's not writing people off because of political or perceived political, stances. We have to be open. We have to open the tent. And so there's an important moment, but it can go many different ways.
Josh, I love the story about going through the attic and coming across this literal treasure trove of cultural Chinese American history, and having your dad sort of be like, oh yeah, that was some film I took. And so really diving into this and learning about another part of your father and about Chinatown. What was the story that you ultimately wanted to tell with your film?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It helped me in terms of making the film to not know that much, because on the other hand, my dad, he knows too much. I mean, once he starts talking about a topic, he goes into such detail that we're like, okay, we're not making 20 films, we're trying to make one film. So for me, just kind of like hearing a lot of these stories just for the first time, it just helped me to say, okay, what did I just like react to emotionally? What stories are really catching me, and let's kind of go with those, because filtering out all of the vast history and the important stories was really tough. But what came out of it, I think, what we ended up really focusing on was that there was a generation of young, loud and strong Asian Americans who used what they had to fight for their community, to fight for others. And we asked all the interviewees kind of some of the same questions. And one question that we asked every interviewee was, what did you know about social justice and community organizing before you got involved? And every single interviewee said, I knew absolutely nothing. And I think that's, for me, it's really actually inspiring. And I'm hoping for others that that's also inspiring, to say like, hey, you don't have to be a 100% super activist to get involved. It's not like, it's not all or nothing. We all can try to identify like what we're passionate about and what skills we have, and somehow contribute that in that way, and just try to improve things day by day. And for me, that's really helpful, because I can get very overwhelmed by all that's happening in this world, and like, what can I do? So just trying to like focus in on that, just like they led by example, all of the activists in the film.
Chris, as a community organizer, do you still find that to be true, or do you find that folks now are more have an activist mindset, more prepared, or is it still kind of an organic thing that rises up in response to events?
People are very unprepared, unfortunately, because they are focused still on survival and life because of the large waves of immigration. And I guess I shouldn't be too judgmental, but I was always interested in these things. and that was just natural because maybe because of me or my family. And but it's never too late to join the party. And all you need to do is educate yourself and to know and to listen to your voice as to what you're interested in and what you would like to do. I myself, having studied Asian American studies, Chinatowns, Chinese history for much of my formal education, and then I graduated, I had no idea what to do with it. And took about 13 years of just working, trying to pay off my student loans. I haven't done it yet, and and then I saw an issue, and I was like, I have to do this. I cannot not do this. I am compelled. I can't even decide. And maybe you won't be as lucky to kind of get that issue, but if there's some spectrum where you're like, that really moves me, I really care, like just like Josh said. And if I could take one of the questions, Ryan, if you don't mind, I'm reading the question. Do you think or feel that Chinatown can evolve to mean something different to a new generation? And how is something in your personal experience? So I'll answer the first one, because I've been actually thinking about this. I'm very glad, anonymous attendee, that you asked that. Chinatown means different things to different people. To Americans who love noir and watch the Roman Polanski 1974 film Chinatown, which is not really taking place in Chinatown. Chinatown is about sort of larger forces that happen and evil and can't do anything about it, even if you're a good person. Oh, so someone else has defined Chinatown, and many like non-Chinese people kind of like, oh, well, if you love Chinatown, what do you think about that film? Well, it doesn't mean anything to Chinese people. It's a pretty negative connotation of the use of that term. And it doesn't really define the experience of all the lives in there, right? So Chinatown's definition is always being contested and must be owned. I think first and foremost by the community of which it is named for, right? So there is an area of contesting about how we own that. And I think that, talking about the new areas, and there are like 9 maybe neighborhoods in New York, but there's really like, I would say definitely there's like 4. There's like Manhattan Chinatown, there's Flushing, there's Brooklyn 8th Avenue, Big 8th Street in Cantonese, and then there's Elmhurst, right? Large Southeast Asian Chinese diaspora and Southeast Asian. And they are all conceptually like part of Chinatown, and I think that's what people who grew up in Chinatown and traditional Toisan, Cantonese Chinatowns have to grapple with, which is that the idea of Chinatown is going to start there, and we must learn and understand where it comes from. But that idea is expanding, and it's all even expanding to those suburban, quote unquote, Chinatowns, and those ideas and that experiences and that description. And maybe I'll get to a point where they don't fit, but those are part of that experience. And I think that it means something to a new generation. Chinatown has always been a great part for me to get the food and the drinks and the breakfasts that I like as a Chinese person that make me feel kind of human. Like I go to Chinatown, I get the breakfast of congee or like a really good Hong Kong milk tea that's made the right way, and that makes me feel like, yeah, that's what I needed, in the morning. And I feel that very deeply in my soul. And so those things really make me happy that at least there's someplace I can get it.
Josh, do you want to comment on that? Or
no, just that he's making me hungry.
Yeah. The second part of the question that Chris shared was, how has something in your personal experience as a Chinese American person really resonated with you through your career or life? If you both want to touch on that.
I feel really lucky to be a Chinese American. My dad has always told me we're going to take the best of both cultures, and we're going to be, my dad always taught me to be really proud to be a Chinese person. And I think it really gave me this rock, like, in the 80s growing up, a lot of people were kind of down on being Chinese, to be honest, if you remember back to that period, and they were not particularly proud and whatever. But I have to say that my dad always was like, you're going to be proud. It's great. It really is. I'm like, I'm not so sure about that, Dad, but he's right, and we take things that are really great from both cultures, from being an American and being Chinese. And then we have such great perspective because we have a foot in both cultures. And I feel comfortable, I'll say, in both places. When I'm in Hong Kong and China, I feel very comfortable. When I feel, but once I had that comfort, I felt very, very comfortable back here. Like I felt like was rooted in that identity. I could root myself in this identity as an American too. Being Chinese American, Asian American, all those things made sense to me, that multiplicity. So once I was rooted in that, I found myself much more comfortable sort of exploring the history of Chinatown.
Great, thank you. Another question from the Q&A here. Josh, we know that you weren't aware of the film before you seriously came across it in the attic there, but how much did you know about your father's background as like an activist and what he had done? Was some of that known to you, or was he mostly just dad?
Yeah, I knew almost none of his activist history. Growing up, I just knew that from when I was a young child, he was always in meetings, and I was busy doing my own thing as a young person. I think my dad is a pretty humble person. He's kind of like just an action-oriented person, just kind of do it, and that's what you should be doing. So he didn't really bring it up at the dinner table or anything like that. I think he still has some of that the Chinese, that Chinese thing of keeping your head down and like not making waves too much, or not tooting your own horn. He still got some of that for sure. And when I asked him later, like during this project, I said, how come you never told me about any of this stuff when I was young? He said that you never asked, which is true.
Right. Well, how would you know to ask, right?
Yeah.
Like, part of being a Chinese learned person, sort of the Confucian scholar tradition, was to do amazing things, but never to speak of them, and that others would speak of them. So there is so there's a great Taiwanese restaurant that I love to go to. Been going there for many years. I followed it from when it was like in downtown Flushing to like Bayside, like further out. Then one day I read the New York Times, and it was about the owner of that restaurant. And it was like this, and I forgot her name, right? She was like a huge star in Hong Kong movies, with Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan in the 70s, and was called like the female Bruce Lee, or like, made like 3 or 4 amazing movies of that period. And then came here, got married, and runs a restaurant in Flushing, Queens. And I'm like, the lady that sits in the front kick some butt with Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan. You know what I mean? Just like, you know what I mean? It's just like the heroes are among you. So get to know them.
I was going to say, Chris, in your work, do you find that most of your students are pretty much on, these were pivotal movements, and people are very much aware of groups like the Black Panthers and others that were very vocal and advocating in activism. But do you find with your students, is this pretty common that they're basically unaware of the Chinese American, Asian American activism that happened during this period and later?
Yeah, it's hard because there's East Coast, West Coast, generational immigration time. It's like the divide is massive, and they don't know about the West Coast, and the West Coast doesn't know about them, and having traveled between the two and lived between the two, because I very actively wanted to, once again, that took a lot of work. A lot of people on the East Coast don't do that. Neither do they have the luxury. So I feel, like I'm privileged, right? But it's a big country. It's a big world. It's difficult, but I'm doing my best. I'm doing my part, right? So I teach as an adjunct. So when the kids come in, they're going to get that, and I have to walk them through because they don't know what SF state is. They don't know what Cal means, like that history is, right? That's really far away. I have to explain all these things to them. And it took me a long time to get it. Be like, okay, what does that mean? What does SF state mean? What does Cal mean? Why was one movement here different than it was there? And why does one get more sort of attention overall? Like stuff like that. And but I'm glad to do it.
Very, very good. Yeah, it's interesting as Chinatowns. I think I know I'm from Los Angeles. Our Chinatown, as you mentioned, Chuck, Josh, in your early talk, you talked about how Chinatown was an exotic place, and it's funny. My grandparents used to talk about Chinatown. Go for the restaurants and go see the shops, and it was an exotic, like unknown. And now here in Los Angeles, at least, a lot of the Asian American migration, Chinese American migration is out of Chinatown, and Chinatown's just sort of history now. And so so how do you both reconcile that with Chinatown maybe being historically significant but not as significant in terms of a hub for culture, for how do you guys reconcile that? What do you what's the future of a Chinatown, we'll say?
Like the San Francisco Chinatown will, because of the nature of San Francisco's urban space as designed by its geographical sort of space, is going to be maintained, I think. And so I think, so once again, it's the spiritual capital of Chinese America. Los Angeles, like many things, and I'm very fond of Los Angeles because of course I went to UCLA Law School. The Chinatown there, everyone moved east. They went to the 626, right? They're like, I want to live in a house, going over there, right? So that spirit has come. But then in Monterey Park, you drive from place to place, it's hopping, and it's really good. Like some of the best food maybe in all of the country, right? And so the spirit is different. It's a different thing, right? It's Los Angeles. It's the car. It's the strip mall with the amazing food. You know what I mean? And it's just different. And it's not as concentrated. But it's got great things. It's got the CACA Lodge down in LA, just like we have in San Francisco, right? But recognizing that each city, brings its own version of Chinatown, and it's kind of back to the history or the future, that it's becoming something different. But just because San Francisco Chinatown is special and what it is, doesn't mean that's the only way it has to be.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Ryan, that's the big question that I think a lot of us are asking ourselves, and like, what does the future hold? I think the fact that there are many more Chinese communities that are thriving, that are in different cities, different areas of the country, I mean, that's a good thing overall. I mean, those are at least in San Francisco, the Bay Area is filled with Chinese people who have roots in Chinatown, who have whose families started in Chinatown, and they were able to buy a house and do what they wanted to go. So it's a good thing. I mean, I think the important thing is for those people to be aware of and keep acknowledging that they benefited so much from their families being able to land in a place like Chinatown, a place where they could feel safe, where people spoke their language, where they could get a job more easily, where the food was theirs, where the hospital, everyone speaks Chinese, all the people who have moved out and are living in the suburbs and, have to still understand there are still immigrant families coming to San Francisco and landing in Chinatown. And that all of our families were once in that place. So I mean, it's really hard because sometimes you think of going to Chinatown here in the city and it's like, oh, parking's terrible, and prices can be high sometimes, or like it's not what it used to be. But we have to stay connected, I think. And yeah, maybe it's not a place we're going to visit every day, but it's a place that we can still support, and support the families that are just getting here and who are facing a lot of the extra challenges, that come with being an immigrant family.
It's interesting you touch on that, because that's certainly true of LA Chinatown. Chris, you touched on that as well. First migrants, Chinese American migrants to California, to America, were particularly Toisanese. Now I think it's really, you know, more widespread throughout China. So it's, and kind of going to your point, Chris, about there being enclaves of Asian Americans, Chinese Americans all over, and you know, and still being, you know, just different, but you know, not the same, not a hub of Toisanese culture or Chinese American culture, but these other things. We have two questions in the Q&A that I want to get to for you, Josh. Besides raising what I presume to be the next Chuck family activism, the next generation of Chuck family activism in the background. The first question is, you know, did your father end up moving to the suburbs as well from Chinatown, or have you guys maintain a foothold in Chinatown? And then, you know, what's next for you? What do you have, you know, on the horizon? Do you plan more documentaries, more self-discovery? How will you continue?
Yeah, appreciate those questions. My dad, he ended up moving out of Chinatown because when he retired from working at Cameron House, he was living at Cameron House. And so he had to go somewhere. So he went to, I guess we call the suburbs of San Francisco, the Richmond district, which is 4 miles away and more towards the beach, and has a huge Asian population and its own little Chinatown street, you know. So that's where he lives, and he's lived there for a couple decades. Yeah. For me, yeah, I'm looking at some different projects to take on, and they all have to do with the same time period and the same community. I think there was a lot we had to leave on the cutting room floor. There were so many interesting stories and so many important stories, and it was just kind of heartbreaking to like say at the last, you know, towards the end of the process, okay, we're cutting that whole thing out. We can't include that. So there's those stories, and more, I think. And I think that, you know, what I personally like about the film is just the personal nature of the storytelling. We found people who were willing to tell very intimately like what they were involved in, and it's so much different than when you watch like a documentary about, say, if you watch a documentary about the Civil War, you're going to hear the people talking and telling you about it are historians or scholars, which is fine, but that's basically people telling you about what they read. And that to me is, it's such a different vibe. And so if we're going to document, you know, more of the stories of this generation, it's pretty much now or never. You know, we interviewed, I think in total about 30 to 35 people for the film. And if we tried to interview those people again today, you know, 6 years later, 5 years later, 7 or 8 of them are not around anymore. And that's only going to, I think, accelerate. So yeah, so I'm focused on figuring out, you know, who we can talk to, who we can interview, and it's just going to take a little bit of resources to kind of get that going. But we've started, and it's been encouraging so far.
That's fantastic to hear. Chris, any projects or anything that you want to highlight, or anything you're involved with, or organizations that you'd like to bring attention to?
I've been working lately on anti-Asian violence through the Asian American Bar Association of New York. We released a report in February of 21, and we have a follow-up report that's going to be released at the end of May. Our follow-up report. It's focused on New York, but as always has implications for the country. And so, you know, if you're interested, just Google AAPI Anti-Asian Violence Report after May 31st, and it'll be available for free to download.
Thank you so much. And then Josh, I did want to make sure I highlighted this. I believe you have a talk tomorrow, and then I'm sure you're all very excited to see Chinatown Rising, and there's several ways to do that. One, though, is to watch it on World Channel. I'm going to place a link in the chat, and then Josh, if you could talk about your talk and also Chinatown Rising in terms of when it'll be featured on World Channel.
Thanks. Yeah, we have a talk like with my dad and our producer and a couple of the interviews from the film. That's going to happen tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern. And that's can be found on like the World Channel, all the social media stuff, the Facebook and all that. And then right after that, we're going to have our broadcast premiere on World Channel. World Channel is like it's like a PBS subsidiary kind of thing. So you kind of have to look on your local listings to see what actual channel number that is. Like, for example, like here in San Francisco, it's 190. So everyone has their own local listings. So it's going to show tomorrow at, here it's 5 p.m., but East Coast 8 p.m. And then it'll show several more times during the week. The other way you can watch it is World Channel. The World Channel website is going to host the film for 30 days for free streaming. So that's going to start at the same time tomorrow, at the same time as the broadcast. So it's tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern, and it'll be available for 30 days. Yeah, we're hoping, you know, anyone who watches or feels inspired to watch will also share with others. And, you know, and our another main goal is to get into classrooms. We have a whole, we spent a lot of time and resources creating educational resources for the classroom, because that's where we want to be. You know, I think if I had grown up and, you know, if I had watched a film like this in school, I think my perspective and outlook would have been a lot different about myself and about others. So I'm just hoping, you know, for my young child, you know, when he grows up in school, he'll be able to see films like this that represent, you know, the immigrant story and all different kind of perspectives. So those are our goals. And yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate it. Thank you both for today, Josh and Chris. I really appreciate your time and your answers to our questions. And I want to thank all the attendees. We really appreciate you being here. And I want to especially thank the Chinese Heritage Foundation for putting these on. It's been an amazing effort from them to put these on basically daily for the month of May. It's 2 years in a row that they've done this. It's there's a lot of work that goes into this, and they don't get nearly enough praise, and Esther doesn't get nearly enough praise. So I'll do it here, and then I am here on behalf of my lodge and the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, and I do want to get a quick plug in for us and just let you know that if you're ever in the Los Angeles area, you guys please come in and say hello and meet our members. So thank you again, and thank you, Esther. And I want to just one more time thank all our attendees. Thank you.
Yep. Well, thank you so much. Great discussion, great moderating. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's very educational to me. And thank you for both of your insights. So tomorrow, if you have time, please go to World Channel and watch the film. After watching those 3 excerpts, I can't wait to watch the film. Josh, I still didn't have the chance to watch it, even you share with me. So now I know there's so many days that I can watch. Can't wait. So thank you, Chris, for joining us. I know your time is precious. Thank you so much. Great job, Ryan. So everybody have a great night. Thank you for attending, and go to our website, chf.us, and there are a few more webinars coming up. Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, I learned a lot from you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be part of it. I learned a lot from watching your thing. I mean, everything builds on everything. So, and this is the 3rd one I'm doing today. So, but I'm so glad.
Wow.
Yeah, literally, I did like one in a car on the way to high school that I gave a talk about, and then I came back to the office to do this. It's 8 o'clock. It's 9 o'clock now. So, but so I'm energized by learning. So it's all just good, Josh. So really, I mean, you're right. There's so many great stories. There shouldn't be one documentary. There should be a master documentary that is about that era, and so much of that era is iconic. Another thing is that the modern iteration of going to Chinatown is like, oh, this is cheap food in Chinatown, and I know that people mean well, but I'm just like, I hate watching those things. you know, because it's not about, it's like the cheap food, like that's why you go to Chinatown. Like, you know, it's something we need to sort of think about, you know, like, you know, how that gets associated. But anyway.